Jim and Lynne Weber are both master naturalists and have published a number of books, including Native Host Plants for Texas Butterflies. Their new book focuses on native host plants for Texas moths and should be a fascinating resource. The authors joined remotely with our new Braunfels chapter in March 2022.
My name is Lynne Weber, and this is my husband, Jim. One thing I want to say just before we get started is, of course, we're at home. We have a 15 or 14-year-old cat, Sam, who's already starting to meow at us because when we're at home and talking like this, he thinks we're talking to him. So if Jim needs to quiet him down, he'll go get him. But just FYI, you may hear him meowing or yowling and talking at us.
Yeah.
All right, so what are we going to talk about tonight? Well, let me take you through kind of the agenda. I'm sort of course, speaking to the choir, but we're going to talk a little bit about the ecoregions of Texas and why Texas is so diverse. Talk a little bit about why natives are important and why we shouldn't use non-natives. In that same scope, we'll talk about what's a host plant and what's a nectar plant. And then we'll get into Lepidoptera lifestyle. Lepidoptera is defined as the order of insects that includes butterflies and moths. We'll talk a little bit about the kind of general differences between butterflies and moths, chrysalises versus cocoons, the different life cycle stages, and how they find mates as well as host plants. I'll then take you through 15 selected host plant species accounts, which are directly from the book, and the moths that are associated with those host plants. And then I'll finish up by talking a little bit about gardening for Lepidoptera, how you can plan and maintain your garden, and what other ways you can attract moths to your garden. We'll finish up with some of our techniques to photograph moths. I think you'll find those pretty interesting.
Oh, God.
Oops. Okay. This is going a little slower than I thought. The plant diversity of Texas. I'm sorry, let me go back. Ecoregions of Texas. As you know, depending on which map you use, there can be 10 or more ecoregions of Texas. And each one is defined by several different criteria. Texas, as you know, is very large in land size, second only to Alaska. The natural areas that we have defined here and in the book are 10 different ecoregions, and they vary in climate as well as habitat diversity. There's a bunch of topographic diversity in Texas. You may or may not know that there are 91 mountain peaks a mile or more high, mainly in West Texas. And Texas is a transition zone. It's where the ranges of eastern species meet the ranges of western species, and where the ranges of southern species meet the ranges of northern species. We have a huge diversity of rainfall as it ranges throughout the state, as you know, and we certainly, as I'm sure you can, could be using more of it right now. The slides are taking quite some time to change. So forgive me if I'm hesitating here. Wow. Yeah, see, that's going to, okay, the plant diversity of Texas. Second only to California, Texas has the highest number of plant taxa at over 6,000, divided into more than 220 different plant families. Now, compared to butterflies, which there are about 500 species recorded in Texas, there are about 4,700 moth species that are currently known in Texas. Some moth species and their host plant associations are known, but many are still being discovered. And we'll talk about one that was just discovered in 2013. Moths do utilize many different types of plants as host plants, including trees, shrubs, wildflowers, vines, grasses. And there's even some moth species that feed, their larvae feed on lichen and algae. We're not going to go through any of those here, but I'll refer to them in one instance. And just like for butterflies, plants are the principal factor for dictating the distribution of moths in the state. Now, I'm sure this is something you all know, but it's never hurts to have a refresher. Why do we want to plant native plants? They do provide essential services and keep our ecosystem healthy. They help us reclaim land, they protect our waterways, protect and produce soil and preserve it, and they keep nutrient cycles intact. When you remove a plant, a native plant that an insect may be using, you're also removing the caterpillars that insect is a form of, the birds that feed on those caterpillars, the other animals that may feed on the birds. So you really are disrupting that nutrient cycle. Native plants are already adapted to our soils, to our climate. They're hardier, they're relatively disease-free, and they do create that habitat for all our local wildlife. They provide food, shelter, places to raise young, and I think just as importantly, they are beautiful reminders of our natural heritage here in Texas. Okay, it's not liking that. All right, so why not non-natives? And forgive me, it seems like I have to go forward 2 and back 1 in order to advance. The FDA actually has a definition of non-native as a plant or animal living or growing in a place that is not the region where it naturally lives and grows. The problem with non-native species is that they are frequently invasive, although not always, and they often outcompete all the native species. How do they do that? Many of them produce copious amounts of seed, and that seed is transported quickly by water, wind, and birds. Many of them thrive on poor or disturbed soils. Many of them have aggressive root systems. Some will even leaf out earlier in the season and last longer later in the year, or even produce growth inhibiting chemicals that prevent other native species to grow. And as I mentioned, they disrupt the natural nutrient cycles when they replace other native plants. One interesting thing to note, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency says that all of our non-native plants that we use in our lawns and gardens are sprayed with over 90 million pounds of insecticides and herbicides every year. The mowers, edgers, and blowers that we use emit 27 million tons of air pollutants each year, not to mention being very noisy. And landscape irrigation squanders water. That water is generally drinking water, actually drinking water, 9 billion gallons per day. And if we plant natives, we won't need most all of those things. It has also been proven that non-natives decrease the biodiversity in a habitat. Roughly 42% of endangered and threatened species are affected detrimentally by non-natives, and 18% of those have become endangered or threatened as a result of non-natives. Non-natives arrive in our area, and that's really when we need to try to prevent them from taking hold. They're introduced usually from some other place. They become established. They reproduce and spread, they displace the natives, and eventually, if they're not controlled, they will dominate the ecosystem. I've listed here many of the non-natives that we have to deal with here in Central Texas. And I thought I'd include this little comic strip where the neighbors are talking, and the woman says, sure, it's a bit of an invasive plant, but I haven't gotten any complaints from our neighbors. And there's her neighbor on the other side of the fence, absolutely encased in this vine. So let's talk a little bit then about native plants. And for this talk, we want to know the difference between host plants and nectar plants. Host plants are the plants that female butterflies and moths deposit their eggs on. These are the plants that provide food for their caterpillars. And it's very specific in a lot of ways. Many butterfly and moth species require these specific species of host plants in order for their caterpillars to eat. Nectar plants, on the other hand, are plants that are food sources for the adult butterflies and moths, not the caterpillars. And the flowers that provide ample nectar and landing platforms are favored. And this nectar source selection is much less specific than host plant selection. And typically it's not the host plant, and an adult form of a moth or a butterfly will typically nectar on many different species of plants. In terms of what are the general differences between butterflies and moths, the antenna is one place to look. Butterflies' antennae generally have a small club at the end, whereas moths, their antennas are feathery or sawtoothed or very thread-like. The wings of butterflies tend to be folded vertically over their abdomen. And for most moths, although not all, they tend to be folded in a tent-like fashion, often hiding their abdomen. Butterflies, for the most part, are typically diurnal or around during the day, but some are crepuscular, meaning they're around at dawn and dusk. But moths, on their other hand, are typically nocturnal, but some are actually day flyers. Butterflies, when they go through their metamorphosis, form a chrysalis in the pupal stage, but moths, on the other hand, form a cocoon. It's interesting to note that the number of moth species in North America outnumber the number of butterfly species by about 15 to 1. So there are many more moth species. And like I said earlier, we don't even know all of them yet. I mentioned the chrysalis and the cocoon, and sometimes people get confused over these. The chrysalis, again, is the pupal stage of most butterflies, so the stage in between being a caterpillar and an adult butterfly. Some butterflies actually pupate in the plant roots or stems or even the pods of plants. The word chrysalis is from the Latin meaning gold, and it refers to the metallic-like coloration that often is present on most chrysalises. And it is a very hardened case, and typically it's formed in the open, and it's attached to a surface by a combination of a silken pad that the caterpillar spins and then hooks into with hooks at the tip of its abdomen to be able to hang from a surface. The cocoon, on the other hand, is the pupal stage of most moths. However, some pupate in an underground dirt chamber, and we'll get to some examples of that later on. The word cocoon is from the medieval French, and it means eggshell, or really shortened to shell. It's a soft material, but it's quite a tough silken case, and it's typically camouflaged with bits of vegetation. It's often also attached to twigs or pieces of vegetation, and it's often in a concealed location, so they're usually a little harder to find. In terms of the life cycle of a moth, it's very similar to a butterfly. So eggs can be laid either singly or in multiples, and that depends on the species. Some species lay eggs on the leaves, others on the stems, some even on the buds of flowers. The larva caterpillar will then hatch and begin to feed, and it usually, its first meal is actually the egg casing that it hatches out of. And then it starts feeding on the plant, and often different parts of the plant using various techniques depending on the species. As it grows, it actually molts. The caterpillar or larva goes through what's called different phases called instars, and they actually grow and molt roughly 5 times. There's 5 instars. That final instar actually pupates, which is defined as the immature form between the larva and the adult. And for the moth, it does that in the silken casing called a cocoon, but there are some species that actually pupate underground, and we'll get to that later. When the adult emerges, which is also called the closing, some of those adult moths don't feed. Many do, but some don't. So now that we've talked a little bit about how moths are different from butterflies, let's talk a little bit about how they find a mate and how they find host plants. How moths find a mate, the females actually release what's called an airborne pheromone from a gland at the tip of their abdomens. The scent is very species specific. The male will sense it sometimes from miles away through receptors on the male's antenna, and they're called sensilla. So if you look over here where my arrow is, you can see this inset. The picture of the antenna of this Cecropia moth are very thread-like. That's the female. And then this picture down below where the antennae are fan-like, almost like fans of coral. So it's increasing the surface area. You can tell that that's a male because he needs that extra surface area for those receptors to be able to find the female. It's important to note that insects that eat plants, and there are many besides moths and butterflies, are called phytophagous. And those that eat more than one type of plant are called polyphagous. Those that eat only one type of plant are called monophagous. So for example, the gray hair streak butterfly is polyphagous. It eats many different kinds of plants. On the other hand, a monarch butterfly is monophagous because it only eats milkweeds. So if these associations are specific, how do these moths find their host plants? Well, what we do know, scientists say that they utilize both chemical smell and taste, and they differentiate plants by odor and taste. And how they do that is moths actually have receptors on their legs and on their antennae. What we don't know is if they use any kind of visual cues, or if they lay eggs on plants that grow in abundance so they can increase the chances of survival, or even if they learn the locations of plants and since many moths and butterflies have more than one brood throughout the year, do they learn where these plants are for the next time they're ready to lay eggs? So now that we know a little bit about moths compared to butterflies, we know how they mate and find each other. We know how they find the plants. Let's talk about some of these associations that are known here in Texas. So what you're going to see on the next 15 slides, and hopefully I won't bore you too much, is on the left-hand side will be the plant photos, and we'll show you kind of what the main plant looks like, some detailed photos and the range map where that plant occurs, because remember, plant distribution is really the principal factor to determine moth distribution. I'll then talk a little bit about some interesting facts about the plant and the moths that use it, and we'll have a picture of the adult moth as well as the caterpillars. We do list in the book any additional moths that might use this plant, so that can tell you which plants are really popular.
Rain bleeds.
Is there a question? Okay, I'm going to continue then. All right, the first is the giant rain lily, which I think you all are familiar with. This is the one that blooms mainly in the spring, although it can be triggered by rains through August. It is often confused with the Drummond's rain lily, which has narrow leaves and it generally blooms more in the fall. The two species that use it that are moths are the etched Cerathosia species, and its species name is actually tricolor, which is it's named that because of the yellow, black, and white bands on the caterpillar. The straight line Sedosia also uses this plant, and you can see the picture of the caterpillar on the actual seed head of the giant rain lily. And you can tell the difference between the male and the female Sedosia because the female has those white spots and the male does not. I'm hearing another voice. Is everybody else on mute or? Okay, I'm going to continue.
Wow.
I'm sorry, I'm hearing, was it Mary Williams? All right. Next is Firewheel, which is also known as, of course, Indian blanket. It is a common daisy-like flower, and its scientific name, Pulchella, actually means beautiful little or pretty. It does often form colonies that create a rich tapestry on the ground, which is how it got the common name of Indian blanket. And the moths that use this plant are called Shinia moths. They're also called flower moths, and they often nectar, rest, and lay eggs on their larval host plant, which is really unusual. They spend their entire life cycle around this one plant. These Shinia larvae, like the painted Shinia, are striped and can either have pink or yellow stripes, and they often are found on the flower heads that are producing seed. Western ironweed is another plant we all love. It is a stout, hairy plant with loose clusters of flowers that are purple on top of the stems, and it blooms in the heat of the summer. It starts in July and goes through to November. The common name can be attributed to its tough roots and stems, and even the rusty seed clusters. The moth that uses this is the Parthenice tiger moth. And tiger moths are, as you can see, are very attractive moths. They're often striped, banded, or spotted. And the larvae of some of these tiger moths are very specialized species that actually eat blue-green algae and tree bark lichen, which are really unusual plants.
I gotta put some shorts on. It's hotter than hell back here.
Who's got shorts on and they're hotter than hell? Please mute. Thank you. All right. One of the things that are typical about tiger moths is that they are very attractive. They often have striking patterns on them. They're banded or spotted, and the larvae themselves can also be very colorful, and that serves as a warning to predators, please don't eat me. Another plant that's a favorite of ours is Jimson weed, which is also called datura or sacred datura. We love their showy white trumpet flowers, which bloom at night. So they open in the evening and they stay open until it starts getting warm in the morning. So this is a perfect plant for moths. However, this plant's extract is a narcotic and it was once used in native religious ceremonies. So you have to be a little careful with it. The moths that use it are both called Sphinx moths. They're also called hummingbird moths or hawk moths. The Carolina Sphinx moth, which is also known as the tomato hornworm, for those of you who are gardeners, it really has a unique codependency with Jimson weed. And it goes something like this. The adult Carolina Sphinx will nectar on the flowers at night, pollinating the plant. It'll also lay its eggs on the leaves. When the eggs hatch, the caterpillars eat the leaves, and they're big caterpillars, so they normally eat the plant almost down to the ground, but it's got really fibrous tuber roots, and it resprouts. And so when the caterpillars pupate and then emerge as adults, they come back and they pollinate the plants again, and this cycle continues. So they really depend upon each other. And if you are a gardener that loves tomatoes, I recommend planting Jimson weed in your garden, and you shouldn't have to worry about the so-called tomato hornworms on your tomato plants. Honey mesquite is a tree that we are all familiar with. Believe it or not, it is greatly increasing in abundance over the last 120 years, but it's not expanding in its range. And the reason is, livestock will eat its seeds and spread it that way. So that's why it is increasing in abundance. The lining of the legumes on this tree can be separated and ground into a sweet tasting flour. This is done very commonly in Mexico, and Jim and I have tasted it, and it does actually taste like caramel. It looks like a yellow flour, and children will actually carry it around in a pouch and eat it like candy. That is also why livestock likes to eat these legumes, because they are very tasty. The moths that use this tree are a fair number of them, but the ones we have pictured here are Heliogabrot's mesquite moth, which is a South and Central Texas species. You can see its hind wings have that bloodshot look, and so it's also called the bloodshot-eyed moth. And then there's the Io moth. The female there, as you can see, is kind of a purplish brown, but the male is predominantly yellow, but they both have those gorgeous eye spots on the hind wings. You have to be careful with these though, however, because their larvae have stinging hairs, so they shouldn't be handled. Gosh, we're having trouble with this advancing. Oh, there we go. Okay. Post oak is one of our favorite oaks. It is, like all oaks, slow growing. It is a medium-sized tree, and the wood is often prized for furniture and for flooring. It's also marketed as white oak. It is one of our white oaks. It is very resistant to decay, and it actually has evolved to survive wildfires because it has a much thicker bark than other oaks. The two moths that use it in Texas that we pictured here are the Polyphemus moth and the scarlet underwing. The Polyphemus moth is one of the silk moths. It's a fairly large moth. It's got a wingspan of 3.5 to 4 inches. And it's got a different species in West Texas, which exhibits a more darker wing scaling and has some slight differences in those eye spots on the hind wings, and it's called an Aculea moth. The scarlet underwing, their pupa, you can find them because they wrap themselves in silk and then wrap themselves around dried oak leaves. And so they form a shelter in doing so. Sweetgum is a wonderful plant. It's actually more of an East Texas plant, but it does work here in Central Texas. And it's often called sandbur of the forest for its hard, prickly fruits that you can see pictured in the bottom left. The infertile seeds from these fruits have high concentrations of something called shikimic acid, and that shikimic acid is a key ingredient in the drug Tamiflu. The most recognizable silk moth or large moth that uses this plant is the Luna moth, which is characteristic. It's lime green wings, and it's common in East Texas and also here in Central Texas. The larvae of silkworm moths are very large. They can grow up to 5 inches in length. They look like little green hot dogs, and they can be prolific feeders, although the adult moths don't eat. In fact, we have a friend who's a teacher, and he was showing some of the neighborhood kids some larvae from a Luna moth, and he had it on an escarpment black cherry, and he had branches and leaves in an aquarium in his living room, and he had to close his bedroom door because they were chewing so loud he couldn't sleep. Black walnut is another wonderful tree here in Central Texas. It is naturally scarce because it's been harvested quite a bit for hardwoods to be used for furniture, veneer, gun stocks, etc. Also, the nuts are prized for their distinctive flavor, and we humans love them as well as wildlife. Two of the moths that use this plant, this tree, are the regal moth and the walnut sphinx. The regal moth, if you look at its larva, it's got those really interesting hooks on it, and it's often called a hickory horn devil. The walnut sphinx has a really interesting defense mechanism. When it's touched, it actually whistles or hisses. And how it does that is all caterpillars have breathing structures or holes called spiracles on the sides of their body. And that's actually how they respirate or breathe. And what this walnut sphinx does, if a bird grasps it or even a human, it'll force air out of those spiracles and it'll make a hissing sound. And you can actually search for this on YouTube and see and hear it happen. I mentioned black cherry a minute ago. This is one of our favorite plants. It's a wonderful tree. It has fruit in the fall. It has yellow color in the fall. It's a deciduous tree. It blooms beautifully in the spring, has gorgeous silvery bark. And there are 3 different regional varieties, depending on whether you're in Central Texas, West Texas, or East Texas. The small-eyed sphinx is one of the moths that uses this tree, and it feeds mainly at night, and it avoids the newest leaves. That's kind of unusual. Most caterpillars prefer fresh leaves or flower buds. The white furcula is another moth that has a really interesting defense mechanism. If you take a look at caterpillars, they have 6 real legs, and then behind that, they have these thicker things called prolegs that don't turn into legs when they turn into a moth or a butterfly. But they're used to stabilize the caterpillar when they're trying to eat vegetation. This white furcula, when it gets alarmed, it pushes blood into its rear prolegs and elongates them, as you can see on the bottom right, and then whips them about, trying to scare the predator away or to have the bird, if it's in a bird's mouth, drop it. So it's a really interesting adaptation. Desert Yopon. Desert Yopon is a kind of a spiny version of our regular Yopon. It's multi-branched, drought tolerant. It doesn't naturally occur up in Austin anyway, specifically, maybe as far north as San Antonio, mainly found in South and West Texas. Its fruits are relished by wildlife, and it is the plant that was discovered in 2013 as the native host plant for the Texas wasp moth, which you can see is a really interesting looking moth. And I love them because they have these distinctive black and orange flanges on their lower legs that make them look like they're either wearing chaps or cowboy boots. It's a very aptly named moth. Blackbrush acacia is something that is an early blooming, very aromatic plant with thorns. It's a great source for honeybees, nectars for honeybees. And it's normally a South and West Texas plant, but it does all right here, especially if we don't have too many freezes. It is reported to contain substances that actually increase metabolism and decrease appetite in humans. It's not been FDA tested, but wouldn't that be wonderful if that were true? It is the host plant for the black witch moth, and the black witch moth is one of the largest moths in North America, and it has a wingspan of up to 6 inches. If you see it flying around, you're probably going to think that initially that it's a bat. The black witch moth has a lot of myth associated with it. It's also called the Mariposa de la Muerte, or the butterfly of death, even though it's a moth. And many times we see these in Central Texas because they get pushed up north from Mexico during the summer when there's thunderstorms, and they can travel as far north as Canada. There are a couple of myths about it. One is that if the black witch flies into your home, someone in the home is going to die, which is why it's called the butterfly of death. But another myth is that if it lands above your front door, you're going to win the lottery. We did have one land above our front door one time, but we never bought a ticket. So I guess that's our fault. Sanito is a wonderful plant we all probably recognize from landscaping. It can be known as a barometer bush. Many people believe that it blooms in response to rain, but it really technically blooms in response to high levels of humidity and moisture because of the rain. Many of the species in this genus are favored as ornamentals because they are drought tolerant, and they have some really beautiful silvery gray foliage, which is a nice contrast to other things in our landscapes. It's used by the Coletta silk moth, which has a couple of broods. The main one actually is in the fall, which is kind of unusual for moths. Usually it's in the spring, but it does have a smaller brood in March or April. The other interesting thing is that the male Colettas are diurnal, meaning they're out during the day often, and the females are nocturnal, normally out at night. So I guess they must mate at dawn and dusk. I don't know when else they'd meet. American Beautyberry is one of our most favorite understory plants, with its beautiful green leaves and those striking clusters of berries that turn magenta purple in fall. Absolutely beautiful. One thing you may not know about this plant is that it contains several different molecules that have mosquito repelling properties, and they're chemically similar to DEET. So you can crush those leaves if you're out in the field and rub them on your skin, and it may protect you from getting insect bites. The moth that uses this plant is the rustic sphinx. It occurs in Central and East Texas, and it's most commonly around from April to November. The larva of the rustic sphinx, like many sphinx moths, has this what's called a posterior or caudal horn at the end of its body. And in this particular species, it's extremely granulated. And that's one of the ways that you can identify this particular moth from its caterpillar. Cowitch vine is an interesting vine. It's a semi-evergreen vine. It depends on how cold it gets, whether or not it's actually evergreen. And the leaves are very fleshy. And it's called cowitch because it can cause contact dermatitis and have a bit of an unpleasant odor when it's crushed. It's also called sorrel vine due to the reddish stems, and possum grape because of the fruits that turn black in the fall. There's two beautiful caterpillars that utilize it, moths, the Wilson's wood nymph. These particular caterpillars are pretty distinctive in terms of their black and white lines, but they also have these black paddle-shaped projections on their front and back ends. I don't know if you can see them. I'm circling one here and one here. The gaudy sphinx is a beautiful moth because it's that gorgeous lime green color. And its larva has large eye spots that make it look like a snake mimic. And that hopefully keeps predators away. One of our native vines, and I think this is going to be the last association I'm going to tell you about. One of the vines is winter grape. Excuse me, it's a woody twining vine that has tendrils opposite the leaves. Another common grape that we have in our area is Mustang grape. And the winter grape is distinguished from Mustang grape by the smaller fruits and the smooth green lower leaf surface rather than it being glabrous or kind of woolly, like the Mustang grape. The vine sphinx, the adults begin feeding at dusk, like many moths. And their larvae, we show the green form there, but they can be pink, pale green, or even a lemony green. The other moth that we're showing that uses this is the 8-spotted forester moth, and these are day-flying moths. Their forewings are mostly black with large whitish spots, and you should see them flying around some of the things that are blooming right now. Now that we're talking about vines, and I've gone through the last association, I want to show you something that's a little unusual, but it applies to most sphinx moths. The vine sphinx, like most moths, lays their eggs singly on leaf surfaces, both the top or the bottom, as well as the tendrils. And then its larva, the last end star, remember I told you about 5 different end stars, when it molts for the final time, the last end star actually loses that caudal horn, which is normally at the back end of the caterpillar. So that's one way you can tell that's what you're seeing. The interesting part is that instead of forming an actual cocoon, these sphinx moths actually dig underground and form an underground dirt chamber. They can be anywhere from near the surface to several inches below the ground, and it overwinters in that dirt chamber. In April or May, so any day now, and from July to October, so 2 different broods, the adults will emerge from the ground, and typically that happens just after midnight, and they remain inactive for the next day, trying to pump fluids into their wings and be able to fly. The adults are nectar feeders, and they do, of course, like night blooming plants like the Jimson weed we talked about. And they are visually similar to 2 other sphinx moths we have here called the banded sphinx and the white-lined sphinx. All right, now that we've talked about that, we'll kind of wrap up the last section of the talk and just give you some general guidelines on gardening for Lepidoptera. Some things to consider, of course, plant natives. They're the true hosts for these insects, and they require less work on our part once they get established. Don't use pesticides. They are equal opportunity killers. We don't see as many butterflies and moths in our yard as we used to. And we think that it's from all these advertisements for people doing mosquito sprays in their backyard once a month. Use drip irrigation to be water efficient while the plants are getting established. And plant species in clusters. This provides what's called flower constancy to the insects. And what that means is an insect will use less energy being able to nectar in short distances rather than having to fly a long distance in between blooms to get nectar. You should plant a wide variety of types of blooms. The colors matter, the shapes matter. Sequential bloomers, meaning things that bloom spring, summer, fall. And of course, don't forget things that bloom at night. Of course, include both the host plants and your nectar plants so you can feed both the larvae and the adults. Try to plan for density. Doing that will help suppress weeds. When you do plan for density, put similar plants together because you have to consider similar needs for sun, shade, water, type of soil, even kite considerations, and embrace imperfection. Doing less benefits wildlife. And what do I mean by that? Sam, I guess our cat Sam has some comments here. What I mean by that is fuss as little as possible. This is one of the benefits of having a native landscape. Our constant raking, blowing, cutting, pruning, digging, working the soil can damage what you've worked so hard to attract. And remember, some of these things are pupating in a very, shallow level of soil. Many of these things also overwinter in leaf litter, brush piles, etc. The Xerces Society, who is trying to increase the diversity of insects, tell us to leave the leaves. Where the pupa may exist, you can either leave a large circular area under trees or triangular areas between groups of plants, but try not to get rid of your leaves. They are a natural mulch. And be careful when you do a cutback. We never do a cutback until late February, early March, because seed heads are food for wildlife, and we want to give things a chance to emerge before we actually get rid of what they're attached to. Different plant sources for native plants for Texas. You're probably all very aware of these. The Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center is having their spring sale. It started last weekend. We're guilty. We don't have room, but we bought a bunch of things. As you know, they have plant sales in spring and fall. Local interest groups such as yourselves, all the chapters of the NIPSA, Master Gardeners, Master Naturalists. Here in Austin, we even have an Austin Butterfly Forum where many people swap plants as well as caterpillars and cocoons. Native American Seed in Junction, Texas is a wonderful source for native seed if you haven't been familiar with them. And then there are other places around the state. Just to name a few, the natives of Texas and Kerrville, Chihuahuan Desert Research Institute in Fort Davis, UT El Paso has the Chihuahuan Desert Gardens, and of course the North American Butterfly Association in Mission, Texas. A couple of other things to think about when you have a garden for moths and for butterflies is make sure you have some natural moisture. You get that from nectar, but also from dew, from tree sap, and even rotting fruit. This top picture here is a picture of a female black witch moth, and it's nectaring on a fallen persimmon fruit. You can also bait to attract moths to see what kind of moths or butterflies are around in your garden. And you create what's called bait stations. What you do is you take a big jar and you put in a mixture of overripe bananas, beer, molasses, brown sugar, fruit juice, anything like that, and kind of make a slurry out of it. Let it sit in the hot sun with no top on it, no cover, maybe in your garage for a few days. Let it ferment and get a little thicker, and then you brush it on a branch or pour it in a dish. One of the things that is really, really fun to do is create a sugar trail. And you can do that by painting tree trunks at eye level along the trail And then at night, go out with a flashlight and see what's been attracted to it. Kids love to do something like that. It's really a lot of fun. I'm a big kid and I like to do that. One other thing that we do in our yard is we blacklight. How you do that is you create a light trap by hanging either a black light or a mercury vapor light in front of a white sheet, or even just a light colored side of the house. We turn ours on at dusk and turn it off at dawn. And moths are what are called positively phototactic, or they're attracted to certain wavelengths of light. We also rear cocoons. You don't want to look in the crisper drawer of our refrigerator. We have native moth cocoons that are gathered in the wild and also bought from a few sources that we trust of native local species of moths. We actually keep them in the refrigerator. We buy them in the fall. We just put them out in our screened cages on the back porch, as you can see on the lower left here. And then they emerge. And what we end up doing is we put them in a small container. We place them in the refrigerator for 20 minutes so they cool down and they become less active. And then we photograph them, and I'll show you on the next slide how to do that. You can see our two cats here, Sam and Jessie, helping. They love to help. After we photograph these moths, we just release them into the wild to breed, because we do have all their houseplants here on our property. Excuse me. Okay, let me just take a sip of water here. Photographing moths is an interesting thing to do. The picture on the left is an Io moth that was taken just with a close focusing SLR camera and a single flash out on our back porch on a stucco wall. And as you can see, there's shadows. The stucco itself is kind of shiny, so it isn't a super attractive photograph. The colors are kind of muddled. So a friend of ours taught us this advanced technique. We use a white box. This is called a white box. This is the picture on your upper right. And it has 5 synchronized flashes in it, so that, and it's got a master switch on our camera, so that we can position those cooled off moths that we had in the refrigerator on a stick or a piece of bark. We can position it like we like. And when we take a photograph of it, when we press the shutter, all of those flashes go off at once, and they get rid of all of the shadows in the picture, and you get a much brighter photograph, much more vivid colors. You can see the detail in the scales, and we use a black velvet for the nighttime background. So just to give you an idea of what you can get photographing that way, I'm just going to finish by showing you some more moth pictures. So here is the Cecropia moth I told you about. They use Mexican plum, cherry, etc. You can see the size of this moth. I have one sitting on my hand in the lower right-hand corner. You could also see its antenna. They're pretty feathery, so this was a male. Prometheus silk moth. It's another silk moth that's also just as large, about 4 inches in wingspan. The Polyphemus moth, which I believe we mentioned earlier, with those gorgeous eye spots named after Polyphemus, the one-eyed monster. The regal moth, which used to also be called the royal walnut moth. And that, by the way, was taken in the white box with no background and just on the white floor of the box itself. The Coletta silk moth, which uses the Sanito. The Forbes silk moth, and those light green patches you see, those 4 light green patches are actually translucent patches in the wings. And this is really more of a South Texas moth. The Rocky Mountain agapima, also a male, and this is more of a West Texas moth, and a moth that occurs also in New Mexico. the imperial moth. The male and female are very similar in this moth. It just, the amount of maroon or purple varies on each specimen. And of course, the Luna moth, which I think is just about everyone's favorite silk moth. And that's it. That's what we have today. The host plant book for Texas moths, by the way, is a companion guide to our host plants for Texas butterflies. So it's the same format book. You can reach us through naturewatch@austin.r.com. We also have a blog called naturewatchaustinblogspot.com. And our next book project, we've submitted this to the publisher and hopefully it'll be out next year, is called Naturalist Austin, a guide to the flora and fauna of Central Texas. And it has almost 700 species of plants and animals in it that are some common and some unique to our region of Texas. All right, Rebecca is asking, can you recommend resources for kids K through 12 education? I'm not sure what kind of resources you might be asking about, but our book, if you've looked at it, is written in very common sense language. We don't use a lot of botanical terms because we want it to be accessible information to everyone. So I think our book is written in such a way that it appeals to a large age range of people. And I think you can use it to try and find plants or try and design a butterfly or a moth garden and try to attract these things for kids. I also mentioned, blacklighting is a fun thing you might be able to try to do. You can contact us. We can give you more information on where you could get supplies to do that. Doing those sugar trails is really an interesting thing to do, and we're coming into the best part of the year. The springtime is really the time when most moths and butterflies are going to be emerging. So there are a lot of things that you can do to kind of help kids. If there's something specific that you would like us to try and get information to you, please email us. We'll be happy to get back to you. Optimum time to rake or move leaves.
We don't do much raking of leaves. Anybody that's seen our yard would agree to that. We will certainly. I know people, that doesn't work for everybody, but if you can leave some areas where you don't bother raking too much, that'll leave the insects and some other little lizards and things places to lay their eggs and overwinter.
I think what some people have done is, rather than, use a blower to just get rid of them all or rake them up and throw them away, that if you just put them in different areas of your yard that are maybe a little more wild, you can use them as natural mulch. So you can move them around a little, but the whole idea is to try not to just, rake them up or pile them up or blow them away and get rid of them, because you're probably going to be getting rid of some pupa. If you do want to get rid of them, I would say it's going to be later in the spring, early summer, more like maybe June.
I hadn't thought too much about the timing of that, but yeah, I would wait as long as you could.
We realize
for things to emerge.
Right. Everybody's different, and you may have homeowners associations or other places that are have more different rules. Let's see. Dynatrap, great for catching mosquitoes. I haven't heard of Dynatrap. Have you?
No, I haven't.
I don't know if it's a kind of a light trap. Anything like the bug zappers, anything that's going to attract mosquitoes is probably going to attract most other insects, because these things are just not discriminatory. You can't, there's no wavelength of light, there's no sound, there's nothing specific to species that we can, so that we can say, okay, this is bad, I don't want this, these are good, I don't want to harm these things. So try to look at, pesticides, insecticides, zappers, things of that nature is they're just non-discriminatory. They're gonna get rid of probably most everything, unfortunately. And yes, piling up leaves and compost is okay. That's not a bad thing. That's one way how you can keep them in your area and not throw away the good stuff. All right. Oh, he's saying that it's a UV light with a fan that sucks the insects down when they come to light. That's going to take everything. It's not going to be specific to mosquitoes.
Yeah.
UV lights, we mentioned using a blacklight and using mercury vapor lights. And the reason we mentioned both of those, and we usually put both of them out in blacklight, is because you want the widest spectrum, the widest range of wavelengths of light that you can have out there to attract the most diversity of insects. But something like that is going to attract
it's
everything.
going to attract most night flying insects. And I'll say my mosquito strategy is to be out with Lynne at night, because
they like me.
She's naturally sweet, and they tend to like her better and bite her. So, and I'm kind of a sour person, so it generally works to my advantage to just stay close to her.
Same goes true for blister beetles too, sadly. So that's it. I hope you enjoyed it.